Three friends, traveling on a late night train from London to Liverpool, find themselves trapped in a nightmare when a strange, unnerving figure appears in their carriage. As the train hurtles through an endless, dark void, they are confronted by a malign presence that speaks of their doom. Locked inside, with no way to escape, they must face the horror of an inescapable force that haunts them long after they've reached their destination. Some journeys never end, especially when you're running from something that follows you home. Before the story begins, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for our appreciation and press the bell icon so that you can get the notification for our new stories in the future. Let's get back to the story. The train from London to Liverpool was half empty that Friday night, and none of the three friends thought it was anything unusual. It was well after dark, the city streets bathed in the glow of streetlights as they departed from London Euston. The rhythmic hum of the train's engines mixed with the distant sound of clattering wheels against the tracks. Anna, Ben, and Lucy sat in a quiet corner of the carriage, chatting lightly, trying to stave off the exhaustion of a day full of sightseeing and travel. Ben, the most eager of the trio, was the first to fall into the routine of the long journey, sinking into the seat beside the window with a relaxed smile. Can't wait to get to Liverpool, he said, his eyes drifting over the blur of dark countryside flashing by. We'll get there by dawn, sleep in, and then hit the town. Lucy, sitting across from him, tucked her hands into the pockets of her jacket. She was more reserved, the kind of person who liked to observe before jumping into any situation. Her eyes flitted toward the other passengers in the train, but there weren't many. A few scattered souls, a handful of commuters, one or two solitary figures seated alone in far off corners. Nothing that made her feel uncomfortable. Anna, always the realist, clicked her tongue as she adjusted her bag on her lap. Yeah, but we still have hours to go. I hope the train doesn't get delayed. Ben chuckled, shaking his head. Always the pessimist. It's a straight shot to Liverpool. We'll be there in no time. Anna raised an eyebrow. Until something weird happens. Ben rolled his eyes. Weird. What's weird about a train ride at night? You always think something's going to happen. But Anna didn't answer right away. She had a feeling about tonight. A strange, inexplicable sensation that had come over her the moment they stepped aboard the train. She couldn't explain it, not exactly, but there was something unsettling about the way the station had looked. Something off about the train itself, the dull, flickering lights, the smell of something old, like dust and mothballs. As the train pulled out of the station, the rolling hills and small towns began to blur into nothingness. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks became a lullaby, the motion of the train slowly rocking them into a sleepy stupor. Lucy leaned her head against the window, her thoughts drifting. But something was wrong. It was subtle at first, just a small shift in the atmosphere that she couldn't place. Then, a few minutes later, she noticed it more clearly. The temperature in the carriage had dropped, just enough to make her pull her coat tighter around her shoulders. The lights overhead flickered once, twice. Then they went out completely. Anna cursed under her breath, and Ben let out a frustrated sigh. Great, of course this happens when I'm in the middle of a train ride. Lucy looked out the window, half expecting to see nothing but a deep void of blackness. But there was something out there, something moving. A faint light in the distance. It flickered like a lantern, barely visible, but it was there. I don't think that's normal, she said quietly. Anna nodded, frowning. Something's off. You feel it too, right? Ben glanced around, trying to ignore the rising sense of unease. It's just the lights. It's a glitch. Don't make it worse by overthinking it. But Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a presence on this train, something that wasn't supposed to be there. A strange chill crawled down her spine, and she couldn't look away from the dark window. The moving light outside was growing larger, closer. Was it a person? And then suddenly it was gone. As if the train had passed through a tunnel, the light blinked out of existence, leaving the night even darker than before. Did you see that? Lucy whispered. Her voice wavered slightly. Ben gave a short laugh, though it sounded tight, unsure. Yeah, maybe it was just a train ahead of us or something. You know how these things can look weird in the dark. But Lucy wasn't convinced. Her heart hammered in her chest, a tightening in her throat. She wanted to ignore it, to turn back to her friends, to act normal, but she couldn't. Something was in the air, something that didn't belong. The train's rattling continued for what seemed like hours. The flickering lights eventually returned, although the dim glow of the overheads only made the carriage feel even more claustrophobic, like they were locked inside an old, forgotten box. Then, as if orchestrated by something beyond their understanding, the doors at the far end of the carriage clicked open. No one had moved. Anna glanced over at Ben, but neither of them had seen anyone approach. The doors were still wide open when Lucy turned toward them, but no one entered. Instead, from the shadows at the far end, a figure stepped forward. The man was tall, too tall. His face was gaunt, sunken in a way that made him appear sickly, a grim expression painted across his features. His clothes were old-fashioned like something from the 1920s, but it was his eyes that unsettled her. They were wide, unblinking, and inhumanly still, locked onto them with a ferocity that made her blood run cold. Lucy froze. Who is that? Ben and Anna stood at the same time, their movements mechanical, like puppets on strings. The man didn't speak immediately, but when he did, his voice was low, rasping. Do not try to leave. Anna blinked. What are you talking about? This is a public train. You're not allowed to. But she stopped mid-sentence as the train jolted violently, as though something heavy had shifted beneath them. The lights flickered again, this time more violently before cutting out completely. The man was standing right in front of them now. No sound, no movement, except the slow, deliberate way he stepped closer, closing the distance between them in an instant. Leave, he repeated, his voice gaining a weight to it, a compulsion that made Anna's stomach twist. Leave now. Something in the air thickened. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being strained. The temperature plummeted. Their breath formed clouds in the freezing air, yet their limbs felt heavy, sluggish. Ben, ever the skeptic, reached for the door. This is insane, he muttered. I'm getting off. But when he tried to open it, the handle wouldn't turn. The door was locked, as if some unseen force had sealed them in. The man was gone. Ben's heart raced, his breath shallow as panic gripped him. What the hell was that? Anna and Lucy shared a look, but there was no time to speak. The train suddenly lurched forward, the sensation as though it was hurtling down an endless, unseen track. But the outside was completely dark. No stars, no passing towns. Just an empty void. And then the voice came again, this time, not from the man, but from the very walls of the train itself. You cannot escape, it whispered. The train continued on its path, the journey now seemingly endless. They hadn't seen the man again, but the air was thick with his presence, a shadow that clung to the carriage. The lights stayed on, dim and flickering, and the train's motion was jerky, as though it was no longer running on tracks but instead being dragged through a tunnel. But they had reached a station. A proper station. A place with lights. The train stopped, and the door opened. They were back in reality, back in the world they knew. They stepped off the train in Liverpool, each of them shaken, hearts pounding. They looked at each other, unable to put words to what they had experienced. No one else on the train seemed to remember the events. No one seemed to have seen the man. No one even acknowledged anything unusual had happened. But they knew. As they walked through the platform, their eyes met one another. The terror was unspoken, but it was there, raw and exposed in the way their hands trembled, the way they couldn't quite look one another in the eye for too long. They had survived. They had made it. But the memory of what had happened on that train would never leave them. No matter how far they traveled, no matter how much time passed, they would always feel the pull of the night. They would always hear that voice in the back of their minds, reminding them, "You cannot escape." And they never would. I was dead tired. I remember clearly the feeling of exhaustion creeping in as I finished my late shift at the hospital. It had been a long, grueling 12 hours, and by the time I walked out of the building and into the chilly night, all I wanted was to get home and sleep. But of course, I wasn't the only one feeling this way. The streets were quiet, save for a few stray cars and the distant sound of sirens. The city was just beginning to unwind, and the last train to my neighborhood would be pulling into the station in 10 minutes. I always took the last train. It was the quietest, and with the kind of hours I worked, it was the only one that fit my schedule. As I stood on the platform, waiting for the train to arrive, I noticed how deserted the station was. No one else seemed to be in sight, just the faint echo of my footsteps and the hum of the overhead lights. It was around midnight, too late for most commuters, but just right for someone like me, who worked shifts nobody else could handle. When the train finally pulled up, it was almost eerie how silent it was. The door slid open without a sound, and I stepped inside. The carriage was nearly empty, just a couple of people scattered here and there, regulars like me, probably. But what struck me immediately was the atmosphere. It was off. The air felt heavy, almost stagnant, as if it had been locked inside the carriage for years. I shook off the feeling and found a seat near the back, next to the window, where the streetlights outside cast long, flickering shadows. I settled in, pulling out my phone to check the time. Only a few more stops to go, I thought. Just need to stay awake a little longer. But as the train began to move, I felt it. The sudden cold. It was subtle at first, just a slight chill in the air, enough to make me pull my jacket tighter around me. But as the train picked up speed, the temperature dropped even more. I looked around. The few people who were still on the train didn't seem to notice. They were either asleep or staring at the floor, lost in their own worlds. None of them seemed concerned by the unnatural cold. It was almost as if they wanted to ignore it. But I couldn't. I stared out the window, watching the city blur by in the dark. I hadn't even noticed the time passing, but now I noticed that the buildings outside were getting further apart. The streetlights were fewer, more spaced out, like we were leaving the city behind. I frowned, leaning forward to look at the train's display board. It said next stop Oxford Street, but I knew we should have been well past that area by now. "Excuse me," I said, turning to the man sitting across from me. He was an older guy, his face hidden behind the collar of his coat. Is this the right train? Shouldn't we have passed Oxford Street by now? The man didn't respond. He didn't even move. It was as if he hadn't heard me. But then, he didn't need to. His eyes were closed. I glanced around, but there was no one else nearby. It was just the two of us, and the train seemed to be moving slower now, the screeching of the wheels on the tracks almost unnaturally quiet. I stood up and made my way down the carriage, hoping to find someone else, but every door I passed was locked. Every window was fogged up, and even though the train was still moving, I couldn't see anything outside. Just a black void. No sign of the city. Just darkness. I pressed my hand against one of the windows, my breath fogging up the glass as I tried to make sense of it all. That's when I saw it. I saw it. A shadow flickering in the corner of the carriage at the far end. I froze. It wasn't the sort of shadow that should have been there. It moved in jerky, unnatural ways. It didn't flow or shift like a person's would. It was more like a broken, twitching silhouette, stretching and contracting at odd angles, as if it didn't belong to anything alive. I turned, my heart pounding, but the air seemed to thicken around me, suffocating. I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy, as if they were trapped in cement. I heard a faint sound, a whisper, a murmur, and I couldn't tell if it was coming from the figure at the end of the carriage or from inside my own head. It was low, indistinct, and yet somehow I could hear it as clearly as if it were right beside me. You shouldn't be here. I whipped around, but no one was there. The man who had been sitting across from me was gone. The carriage was empty. The shadow at the far end had disappeared too, as if it had never been there. I could feel the temperature plummeting even further now. My teeth were chattering, and my breath was visible in front of me, a pale mist hanging in the frozen air. I tried the doors again, desperate to get out. But still, nothing. Locked. I was stuck in this suffocating silence with whatever this thing was. And then, without warning, I heard it again. You shouldn't be here. The voice was closer this time, almost right next to me. I spun around in a panic, my eyes scanning the darkness of the carriage. That's when I saw a figure, crouched low in the aisle, its face hidden in shadow. It was a woman. I could see her long, disheveled hair, but her features were obscured, twisted in the darkness like she was being pulled away from reality itself. She didn't move, but her head snapped to face me, her eyes wide and unblinking. There was something wrong with her face, too pale, too gaunt, as if her skin was stretched too tight over her bones. She opened her mouth, but instead of speaking, a horrible, guttural sound came out. It wasn't words, it was a scream, a cry of pure anguish, mixed with something far darker. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought I was going to pass out. You should have stayed home. The words weren't just in my ears, they were inside my head. My body screamed for me to run, to get away, but I couldn't move. It was like my limbs had turned to stone. And then, without any warning, the figure lunged. I don't remember how I got off the train. One moment, I was standing there, frozen in fear, and the next I was stumbling out of the carriage, my legs shaking. I don't know how I managed to pry open the door, but when I stepped onto the platform, I looked back. The train was gone. Just gone. I stood there, gasping for air, the cold now biting at my skin. The station was empty, silent. And when I looked down at the ground, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at my feet, was a single, pale handprint, smeared across the edge of the train door. But there was no train. There was no one. I took the first cab I could find, barely able to speak as I gave the driver my address. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear her voice still echoing in my mind, whispering those same words. You shouldn't be here. And now, as I tell you this story, I know one thing for certain: I'll never take the last train again. Because whatever that thing was, it wasn't a passenger. It was hunting. And it's still out there.